good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from today. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Nick Greenwood, and I'm Climate Innovation Lead here at Minimum. The title of today's webinar is How to Translate Your Environmental Data into Business Value. And I think it's a really interesting topic because, as many of you will know, sustainability teams are increasingly being challenged by senior management to both explain why managing sustainability matters to their business and justify the need for investment in the data and systems to do so effectively. Last month here at Minimum, we released a white paper setting out some of our views on this issue. If you haven't had a chance to read that white paper, we'll share a link in the chat during the course of this webinar. But today's really an opportunity to bring some of this to life, and I'm delighted to have two fantastic speakers joining us. We have Cédric Robert, CEO of Clearsum. Clearsum is a Canadian climate advisory firm, and Cédric has extensive experience helping leadership teams turn climate complexity into competitive advantage. Cédric, welcome, and thanks for joining us today. And we have Charlie Bridge, Chief Operating Officer here at Minimum. Charlie works closely with our customers to translate complex data challenges into practical solutions. Great to have you with us as well, Charlie. For those of you who aren't familiar with Minimum, we empower large enterprises to manage their carbon and environmental data. Our platform integrates with your systems to map your entire organization, automatically ingest activity data and emissions factors to produce high quality, audit grade environmental data. In today's webinar, we're going to cover a few topics, primarily through the prism of managing climate related risks and opportunities. We'll start by discussing why it's important to articulate the business value of sustainability. We'll talk a bit about how to link sustainability activity to business outcomes. We'll then discuss a bit what it takes to make environmental data actionable to deliver decarbonisation and business value. I'll ask both Cédric and Charlie to share some examples from their experience. And we'll end on a conversation around ROI. We'll also try to allow a few minutes for any questions, and we'll share a recording of this webinar at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to kick off with you, Cédric. You've been working for a number of years helping a diverse group of clients understand the risks and opportunities associated with climate change and different transition scenarios. Why do you think it's important for sustainability professionals to link their work to business value? And given today's political context, is this need becoming even more pertinent?
Well, firstly, thanks, Nick and Charlie, for having me today. I appreciate the opportunity to share a few thoughts here. To your question, Nick, I think there are three core reasons. The first one, I'll get to the second part of the question afterwards, but the first one would be strategic relevance and resource allocation. Without clear business value linkage, sustainability loses in the boardroom. The fact is that the C-suite speaks in ROI terms and strategic advantage terms. So if sustainability can't do the same, it'll get sidelined as a nice to have as opposed to a strategic imperative. The second point would be how to move from a cost center to a value driver. Framed as compliance or risk mitigation, sustainability just looks like risk or like overhead to me. When it's tied to revenue, protection, market access, operational efficiency, or competitive edge, then all of a sudden it becomes an investment with measurable returns. This shifts sustainability from the defensive play to an offensive play, which I think is highly valuable. And the third reason would be materiality and competitive positioning, because, well, from my experience, the winners in transition scenarios, they spot climate risks and opportunities before their competitors do. And linking sustainability to business value forces you to have a rigorous materiality assessment that shows where climate affects the P&L and the enterprise value. And that is competitive advantage. And why now? Really good question. We know that we're facing some pretty strong headwinds with the backlash that we see on ESG, with the political volatility. The business case to me matters more than ever. Fact is, values-based arguments are vulnerable to these shifting winds. But when sustainability opens markets, captures revenues, reduces capital costs, or protects assets, all of a sudden it becomes somewhat politically insulated because it's just good business. So organizations that can prove this value will keep moving, and those that can't, well, they're likely to stall. So from my perspective, the current political context is a really good time to dive deeper into data quality, to use this data to build better business cases and then make them actionable.
Fantastic, Cédric. That's really great context. Charlie, turning to you, at minimum, you oversee a number of our customer onboarding processes, and obviously you're working a lot with customers to create plans to achieve their goals. When customers first come to minimum, what are the most common objectives they want their environmental data to support, say over the next year or two?
Well, first of all, hello everyone, and it's great to be here having this conversation. But yeah, thanks Nick for that question. When we here at Minimum first start talking with customers, they very often raise quite specific footprinting or data collection goals that they want to achieve. But when we dig a bit deeper under the surface, we find those goals are almost always tied to a wider business objective. As Cedric's just mentioned, compliance with regulation is definitely a fundamental driver. Companies come to us because they need numbers that they can trust. They need transparency on how calculations were performed and to be able to share that with relevant parties like auditors. But this is about managing risk, about avoiding a failed audit, about avoiding an inaccurate disclosure or potentially even incurring a fine. All of those can negatively impact a company's reputation. But as Cedric's just spoken through, this managing of risk looks a little bit like overhead and isn't particularly exciting for a board. So that's why it's interesting that when we find with our customers, almost without exception, they want to go beyond compliance to unlock value from decarbonisation itself. And for that, they need more specific data so they can target action. They also want to distribute accountability for that decarbonisation throughout their whole organisation so they can realistically deliver on their commitments. And here, again, as Cedric mentioned, the ultimate value is revenue and investment, positioning the business with customers and with investors in order to win contracts or get access to more favourable financing. Also want to touch on efficiency because it's an important driver at the process level. Businesses really want to move away from manual data collection and be able to sort of calculate footprints more frequently without incurring additional effort or cost. And this boils down to cost saving or cost avoidance. Freeing up sustainability teams is really important so they can focus on decarbonisation rather than chasing data while at the same time achieving more frequent or more accurate footprints that keep the board engaged.
Fantastic. Thanks, Charlie. I totally agree with you. And in the white paper that we released last month, we discussed some of the different ways in which environmental data can generate business value. And basically, we did bucket it in those three categories of risk management, cost reduction, and revenue generation. I think you both hinted at that in your responses. Cédric, I guess drawing on your experience a bit, of those sort of three categories, which do you think is typically the most compelling to a business C-suite? And those three categories are commonly used, but are there other business value drivers that we're forgetting?
It's a really good question, and Charlie made some really good points. To me, it's really clear. The order is, or the hierarchy is there's no other way that I've seen it before. It's about revenue generation, cost reduction, and asset preservation. So risk falls in that third bucket, and I'll talk about this in a minute. And in revenue capture, the questions that we're trying to address are, is your opportunity or is your sustainability project going to open new markets, enable premium pricing, for example, or create some kind of competitive differentiation? Because growth gets funded. You got to think about you're competing with others in the firm for those dollars. So that's my first point. The second order tier is, does it reduce costs? Now that happens to affect both the capital costs of debt, the cost of debt. How does it better improve investor terms? Does it avoid the ESG discount? The reason why is because CFOs, they pay attention to what affects value directly. And lastly, in asset protection or preservation, does it safeguard the operations against, for example, physical risks or regulatory changes, or again against supply chain disruptions, for example? Now it's defensive, but it remains essential. I've worked in risk management my whole career. Sure, risk and compliance do get attention, but risk management's a bit like buying insurance. Nobody really wants to do it, and you do it because you have to, and sometimes you're compelled to. When it pays off, great, but otherwise, it's not that appealing. So I would say approaching it from that perspective rarely wins a battle budget. On the other hand, you can't avoid it. Today, I lead with strategy. I lead with, does your opportunity open new markets or create opportunities for the business in some capacity? Because it's a much stronger door opener. And you can frame it this way as a strategic positioning opportunity, connecting it to revenue costs or asset protection. It'll usually give you a stronger argument to win those dollars or that funding. To your second question, Nick, I think the paper was fantastic. It did much of the coverage that I would have put on paper myself or supported. You guys did an excellent work there. I would say maybe two things I would add. Market access. I can think of the aeronautical or aerospace sector. Sustainability is a table stake for procurement and opening markets and allowing you to compete on the sustainability front. Having metrics and good data in front of you is essential to the sector. And the second piece, it's a bit softer, but it's very real. It's on talent and capabilities or capacity, because top talent today increasingly favors firms that have a strong sustainability vision, and that will affect long-term competitiveness in the end. So, in a nutshell, lead with strategy and opportunity and win growth. This is how I would position it.
That's really great advice, Cédric, and you've given that to me before when we've spoken on a one-to-one basis, and I think it's really a great way to think about this. Charlie, turning to think a little bit about the environmental data itself that's needed to unlock business value, what characteristics does it need to have? I'm assuming that any old environmental data isn't going to be sufficient to generate the sort of business value we're talking about here.
We live and breathe data here at Minimum, so you're absolutely right there, Nick. But I love this question, and you are spot on. It's really important to distinguish between data that's good enough for disclosure once a year and data that's truly actionable. And as I mentioned before, we're lucky enough to have customers where they all care about the data being that. And in that realm, in order to be actionable, data really needs to meet what we see as 5 key criteria. First of all, it needs to be granular. It should reflect the actual operations of a business, not really high-level averages, because specific data lets you see the difference between, for example, 2 different suppliers or 2 different materials, and that's then what you can use to take an action. Secondly, it needs to be accurate. In order to drive a financial decision, procurement, making a purchase, or an investment decision, the data has to be sufficiently traceable and transparent to withstand quite detailed scrutiny. And if not, those decisions just simply won't happen. As Cédric mentioned, the CFO is just not going to sign off on that. Thirdly, data needs to be timely. We so often find with our customers that when we first start working with them, they're used to working with an annual or a quarterly footprint cycle, which is just too slow to match action. Data needs to match the business cycle itself when those decisions are happening, so they can be part of the actual decision-making process. Fourth, data needs to be shareable. If it's stuck in a file or stuck in a silo or lost in an email somewhere, it won't get used. It has to flow across systems and flow across teams in order to influence decisions. And finally, it has to be context-specific. It really does need to speak the language of the business, whether that's through specific metrics or through the way in which it's aggregated and shared. It's really important. So as an example, we really often find that business-specific intensity metrics are always more useful than total CO2e figures, for example.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Charlie. I think those 5 criteria, and we set them out in the paper, really are essential when thinking about having the best quality data to really be able to move beyond just reporting and into sort of decarbonisation, as well as generating some of the business value we've been talking about. I wanted to shift the conversation a little bit on from sort of theory to a bit of your own practical experience. Cédric, you've worked as an advisor for a number of years across multiple different industries. I was curious to see and understand a little bit where you've seen high quality environmental data unlock business value. Again, it could be within those 3 buckets of risk management, cost reduction, or new growth opportunities. So if you can take us through some examples and provide a bit of detail on that, that would be great, just to bring us to life a bit.
You bet, Nick. A really good question. It had me think, actually, and I started pulling some projects from the roster to see what I could share with you all today. I think I'll start by just saying that environmental or high quality environmental data unlocks value when it's tied to decisions that executives are already wrestling with and working with. Generic ESG reporting rarely moves the needle, but when it's granular, as you pointed out, Charlie, and decision-grade intelligence, then usually it'll have an effect on moving behavior, whether it's environmental management at the ground level or it is working with climate data. Usually when you're well supported with strong data, you'll see some action. 3 projects that I thought of that were compelling. One's about creating new revenues and trying to tie it into what I discussed earlier. The second one's about creating new opportunity and opening new markets. And the third one's really what was going to be a capital expense and cost reduction initiative that turned into a productivity investment in the end. I'll unpack these. The first one, We worked with an oil and gas service provider, and this provider needed, it's a listed organization, it needed a credible long-term decarbonization plan that went well beyond aspirations. So they needed hard targets in the short term to 2030, but then their vision about decarbonizing their business was to build new business lines from 2030 to 2050 to see if they can create new revenue generation to augment and eventually possibly displace what they were doing in the oil and gas sector. In the firm, we invested a pretty substantial amount of time investigating transversal skills. What does the organization do? What could they do elsewhere? And how could they approach this? We then explored new business opportunities with their R&D group and started digging with the P&L leaders. All this data pulled together helped us build a really strong business case that actually was tested against others using the same internal metrics as the CFO would use to measure up where money will be allocated in the future and start mapping out how do you develop this into new business, essentially new revenues. They had planned to test these ideas with the market, but the good thing is that they knew already from early indications and pilots that some of these initiatives were revenue positive, which was really great. And for them, the goal wasn't incremental improvements. It was actually progressively reducing their reliance in the oil and gas sector and moving it completely, if that was the decision to be taken by 2050, into new business lines. In this case, environmental data of high quality were used, and we had emissions data, transmission pathways data, and market dynamics data that became the foundation for strategic P&L transformation. I look forward to following how the business does over the next decade, but certainly an interesting project that leveraged good data. The second opportunity was about opening new markets. This was a tech firm that built technology that measures and helps build resilience at the infrastructure or with infrastructure. And they knew, pretty smart folks, they knew that climate risk was creating some kind of demand or opportunity, but they couldn't pinpoint where. With the help of good data, we established a causal link between physical climate risks and infrastructure deterioration. We then mapped this to where impacts would hit the hardest globally across 9 types of infrastructures and then targeted very specific infrastructure clients for pilot studies. The environmental data revealed not just risk exposure, but also the development of new business cases, of new resilience solutions. So this really opened the door to new conversations and to new opportunities. It turned out to be a broad market thesis at the front end into a targeted series of client conversations that created new revenues from existing and new clients. So at the global scale, this was a very interesting project where we had good leverage with the data. And my third example is with an aerospace manufacturer turning a capital expense project into something that was much more of a productivity investment in the end. This manufacturer was facing operational challenges, rising costs, and productivity challenge. So they were having a difficult time meeting their output requirements because of issues internal to one of their facilities. We used environmental data on air temperature, emissions, and energy consumptions and looked at it deeply. It revealed bottlenecks that affected worker performance and equipment efficiency. The business case showed how facility improvements would reduce emissions, reduce energy costs, increase throughput, and improve worker conditions. So this was a win on all the line with a measurable ROI across all of these 4 sort of vectors. It also showed this on a defined time period. So this turned really a facilities upgrade of a capital expense type to a productivity investment. The common thread here is that environmental data answered questions that the executives were already asking. This was not about sustainability reporting. It's not about, what happens at the end of the pipe. It's about capital allocation. It's about competitiveness, and it's about having operational performance in the end. I'm happy to answer some questions about these at the end, but those were the 3 top examples I would think of here.
Great examples, thanks, Cédric, and I think really varied and nuanced and showing just how environmental data can be used in different ways to achieve different business value outcomes. Charlie, similar question to you. What are some concrete examples from Minimum's customers where decision-grade environmental data has directly created business value for them?
Yeah, it's an exciting question to answer, and I want to express sort of how lucky we are at Minimum to have customers who are truly trying to push the boundary of what's possible in this space, which lets me share these use cases. And I think there are 4 that really bring to light what Cédric's just been discussing, what we talked about so far. The first is a global provider of medical equipment that requires a robust decarbonisation plan in order to win government contracts. It's quite a sort of clear-cut case of supporting revenue generation. In order to accomplish this decarbonisation plan, this customer of ours in turn required a rich Scope 3 footprint that could be then connected to concrete initiatives. By using our platform, we helped them get this in place within a matter of weeks, and then they moved on to successfully secure those contracts. In a similar revenue generation example, we work currently with a US-based consumer goods customer that wanted to expand into a totally different market. And again, echoing what Cédric mentioned earlier. The specific market they wanted to move into here was the EU. And they needed to step up their sustainability credentials to effectively challenge the regional competitors. They really needed to be able to put forward a confident, trustworthy, sustainable message to prospective consumers that could withstand scrutiny. And with our help, they managed to do that, and they've seen really successful growth in that region. Moving over to the investment side of things, we're lucky enough to have a telecoms customer that is active in acquiring and divesting businesses. One of the key drivers for those decisions is, of course, sustainability. But with the high frequency, high granularity data environment that we've set up with them, they've been able to attract the right investors for their divestments, and also rapidly incorporate any new acquisitions into their advanced decarbonisation plans without compromising on them or without slowing down. A final example I want to share is one that's very nuanced, but I want to share it because they're really taking something to a level that we've not seen before, which is really fantastic, and that's supply chain management. So this is a UK-based utility provider who have set publicly very ambitious targets. And they've staked their reputation on these and built a really robust sustainability credential base that they want to maintain. They've incorporated sustainability into the very heart of their procurement processes. And they use granular data built off the back of our platform to support quantifiable selection criteria for each and every vendor on their procurement cycle. And they engage hundreds of these vendors every single year using our platform, and as a result are on track to hit their targets as a result. But the key thing here that we found, beyond them being able to maintain their position as a sustainability leader in the market, is that by discussing these metrics with vendors and by incorporating those sustainability factor into their process, they've actually encouraged their vendors to realize lower costs as well as carbon improvements, because they very often go hand in hand. So they've also realized cost savings as well, which is fantastic. I'm sure I have many more examples to give, but in the interest of time, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, really great examples. Thanks, Charlie. I think I just want to transition finally to the topic of ROI. Cédric, you mentioned that already in your response. A lot of sustainability professionals are being challenged by their finance team to justify the ROI of investing in climate services, whether that's advisory work or software. What are your general views on ROI in advisory and climate services? How do you go about thinking about this?
It's a really good question. I'll preface it by saying it's not always an easy question to answer. And I think across the board, we'll have different views on this. But to me, ROI is not optional anymore. It's kind of the entry ticket. In my experience, every initiative it competes for dollars that are under pressure. And today, the pressure comes from tariffs, revenue growth targets, political volatility, economic uncertainty. And to advance the corporate sustainability agenda, you just have to measure up using whatever evaluation framework that your organization uses. And if you can't speak the language of capital allocation, then you're not likely going to get funded. But where do I see ROI in climate advisory and services? Well, the first question I would ask on the advisory side is, does your work inform better decisions that create or protect value within the organization? Because a decarb strategy that opens up new markets or reduces capital costs is clear ROI, as Charlie just pointed out, a key example in hand. So do risk analyses that prevent stranded assets or help reposition the asset portfolio. Market intelligence that also accelerates growth also has ROI. So if the advisory engagement doesn't answer a question that affects the P&L, the balance sheet, or enterprise value, well, it's likely the wrong engagement. It's not one that will be favored. Now, on the software side, you folks are better positioned to speak to this, but I could say, just from an outsider looking in my experience in the past supporting clients that are buyers of software services, does it replace manual processes? Does it improve decision speed? Does it reveal insights that competitors don't have? Because climate data platforms that automate reporting sure has ROI through efficiency gains. Those that quantify exposure to physical risks do the same thing through better capital allocation. If it's just another dashboard that nobody's going to use, then it's likely going to fail to generate return on that investment. The reality to me is that ROI is kind of a basic metric, and I see its importance only increasing over time. What used to be nice to have is now a must have, and those sustainability professionals that manage to articulate it well in the language that their CFO uses have a stronger chance to win the battle. If you can't justify it, chances are they just won't fund it. So yeah, I know we're pressing against time here. Charlie, Nick, I'll pass it back to you, and let's hope we can get some questions.
Thanks, Cédric. Yeah, so final question for you, Charlie, just briefly building on Cédric's response. I mean, Cédric obviously mentioned efficiency in relation to software ROI. Often we're used to seeing it framed that way. How do you go about thinking about sort of framing business value when thinking about software? Is there more to software than just efficiency?
It's a fair question, and the reason it's fair is because the efficiency benefits of software are very often the first part of an ROI story. They're relatively easy to quantify. You have, on the one hand, the manual hours spent doing, for example, data collection, which comes with a cost, weighed against the cost of software. And it's very easy or rapid to draw an ROI comparison there. And those are real benefits. We don't want to belittle them. But it isn't the full picture. We've been discussing this today. There's more significant business value coming from risk management and, in particular, from revenue. So, for example, access to cheaper financing, winning a contract that you might not otherwise win, qualifying for a tender that you might not otherwise have access to. These impacts, as Cédric's been mentioning, are harder to model generically because they're very specific to each and every business. But this in turn just makes it even more important for high quality carbon data to be made available throughout an organization, especially to department heads or owners of various budget items or those in charge of transformational change. Once you can show where the revenue levers are, that then becomes the basis of a much more compelling ROI case for the C-suite.
Yeah, totally agree. Thanks for that, Charlie. We're pretty much out of time. We've got time for a couple of questions, perhaps from the audience. There's a good question here, which I think might be a nice way to sort of summarize some of the insights that you've been sharing. Appreciate quick responses from you both on this. But there's a question: if you had one piece of advice for sustainability professionals about making the business value case, what would it be? I'll put that first to you, Cédric, and then Charlie. Grateful for your thoughts as well.
I would say if you're working with external advisors, consultants, or platform service providers, pull them in to how to build that business case. Pull them into modeling that ROI, justifying it, and put this in your RFP. Bring your advisors and your providers at the table in that conversation. It'll bring, I think, undoubtedly better outcomes. Charlie.
Yeah, I don't want to repeat Cédric's point because I completely agree with it, but working with so many sustainability professionals with our customers, one thing that I would encourage them all to do is take a look at where sustainability can add value, revenue generation, cost reduction, risk management. Take a look at that across the business. Tie that directly to your time and your team's time where it's being spent, and then look at what you need in order to spend your time that way. And we find, once we've gone through that discussion with customers, it's immediately obvious you need software in order to have the time to realize those benefits. So invest in exploring what time you need to deliver value for the business.
Fantastic. And there's a question here actually from the audience, Charlie, which relates to that, which we can take very quickly. The question is, sustainability data cannot always match business cycles because of the nature of data collection. So e.g. electricity data in Q4. What should be done in such cases? I guess this is a case in point of what you were saying basically about how software can help.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And there's no point pretending or inventing data that doesn't exist. But if I understood the question correctly, you have a business decision to make. What do you do in order to get the best possible data in order to answer that? Well, the first thing is to have any real data in and processed automatically and calculated automatically, and that's something our platform is set up to do. So it's the latest real data. The second thing is to get advanced visibility of when these things might be coming through and implement gap filling. So advanced or intelligent estimations for what you might have. For example, we won't be able to gather this for this quarter, but we want to have the best visibility of what it might have looked like this quarter in order to make that business decision. Specify it in advance, and work with our team, and you can get that complete footprint, even though the raw data might not be there yet. So there's more levers that can be pulled here, but it always starts with intelligent management of your carbon data.
Fantastic. So thanks so much to both Cédric and Charlie. That concludes today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. I hope you found it useful. Do feel free to reach out if we can support you in generating that high quality environmental data and helping to drive business value and decarbonisation. In the meantime, have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you at the next webinar.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.